Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Skeptical Inquirer Presents. I'm Jim Underdown, Executive Director of the Center for Inquiry West in Los Angeles, and the Chair and Founder of the Center for Inquiry Investigations Group. We have an excellent program here today, but I want to just do a quick plug for a couple of things coming up everybody should know about. First, SciCon, our annual conference that hasn't happened annually for a couple of years because of COVID, is happening in Las Vegas, October 20th to the 23rd at the beautiful Flamingo Hotel. And it's going to be fantastic. Neil deGrasse Tyson's going to be there, Richard Dawkins, Penn and Teller, Naomi Oreskes, Julia Sweeney, a lot of our heroes and favorite people are going to be there. And there's going to be some drinking and fun too. So I strongly suggest you register at sciconference.org and meet us in Las Vegas in October. Also, we have some fun episodes of Point of Inquiry coming up. I spoke to Alice Gretchen, who was under the thumb of some Christian fundamentalists as she grew up. We're going to be talking to Eddie Tabash, the constitutional expert, who talked about the recent court cases that have come up in the Supreme Court, including Roe v. Wade and some other stuff that has really affected the secular world. And I talked to some people who used to work for reality TV and got some inside secrets to what happens in these ghost hunter shows and some of this other stuff, what happens behind the scenes to make it look like ghosts really exist and to try to hang on to their credulous audience. But let's get to today's speaker, because that's why we're here. And I'm really excited about this. I've been a fan of this man's for many years now. I have his, this is your first book, your first big book?
First commercial book. I had a couple of university press books before that.
First commercial book. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 18 weeks. Pretty major thing for a book about math. I'd like to see someone else do that. But anyway, of course, I'm talking about John Allen Paulos. He was a monthly columnist for abcnews.com, Scientific American, The Guardian. He's a professor of math at Temple University in Philly, got his PhD in the subject from the University of Wisconsin. He's written scholarly papers on probability, logic, and the philosophy of science, as well as scores of op-eds, book reviews, and articles in publications like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, The Nation, of course, Skeptical Inquirer, lots of other stuff. I showed you innumeracy. He's written many different books. And today we're going to be talking about his book, which is about to come out in September, called Who's Counting? Uniting Numbers and Narrative with Stories from Popular Cultures, Puzzles, Politics, and More. Everybody, please welcome John Allen Paulos. John, thanks for being on.
Oh, well, thanks a lot for the kind words, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here, even though I'm not quite sure what here means anymore. But
yeah, right. We're here on Earth.
Yeah, someplace floating around the whatever.
Well, I just want to say thanks on behalf of all of us who try to promote critical thinking and people understanding the world. Really, numbers play such an important role, and most of the world can be described through numbers. And I think most people, I don't know about most, but lots of people are afraid of math and think they're bad at it and just kind of pull away from it. And, people like you really help them say, no, this isn't impossible.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jim.
So just you're going to do a little talk for about 35,
40 minutes. Yeah. And then answer questions or entertain comments or entertain jokes, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah. So if you, in the course of watching John's presentation, you want to have a you have a question, you can click on the Q&A and we'll curate these. And by the way, if you're trying to comment to everybody else on the call, that's not what happens. We have a team who curates your questions, and so just send it to us and we'll try to get to your good question after John does his thing. So John, thank you and take it away.
Okay, thanks again, Jim. In any case, let me begin. More than 30 years ago, I wrote the book that Jim just mentioned. It was very well received, The Numeracy, and it contains some basic math ideas, a few pedagogical suggestions, a bit of irreverence, and a cataloging of the consequences of Americans' quantitative ignorance, at least those of a considerable fraction of us. But despite many advances in the pedagogy of STEM subjects since then, one of the numeracy's prime leitmotifs still holds today. Too many of us are still enumerate, and this societal innumeracy remains a vastly underrated driver of bad policy and bad politics. Almost, as Jim just alluded, almost every major issue and any minor ones facing the country are made more difficult by believing, or at least acting as if the numbers, probabilities, and relative magnitudes relative to them don't really matter, but they do. Unfortunately, the problem involves not only the formal properties of mathematics, but also understanding what they mean, or more frequently, what they don't mean, and how they should be interpreted. Kind of canonical, trivial example, 2 and 2 is 4, as Ron DeSantis said, that's all you should teach, 2 and 2 is 4. It's also a case that 1 0 plus 1 0 equals 1 0 0, but I don't think he wants to know about non-binary binary numbers. In any case, but as I said, 2 and 2 is 4, but if you have 2 cups of popcorn and you add 2 cups of water to those 2 cups of popcorn, you have approximately 3 cups of soggy popcorn, not 4. So it's perhaps a trivial example, but even the most basic mathematics has to be put into context. There has to be a story about it. And often that story is lacking for more significant math than 2 and 2 is 4. In any case, my new book, Who's Counting? Uniting Narratives and Numbers, is in large part a collection of columns and commentaries, both new ones and old ones. And they discuss a multiplicity of topics, because mathematics is a somewhat imperialist discipline that regularly invades other disciplines. Some of the columns are relevant to public policy questions, involve misconceptions that are unfortunately perennial. Another group, perhaps more fun, deals with puzzles and paradoxes, especially those with social implications. And an appreciation of puzzles and a feel for their sometimes counterintuitive conclusions is likely to make one more sensitive to the mathematics and the beauty of mathematics, the utility of mathematics. And then there's a third group of columns and commentaries that offer a broader conception of what mathematics is. And it's much more than calculation and theorem proving. So why revisit these issues, since I did talk about them in a numeracy and a mathematician reads a newspaper and so on. And I think clarifying at least a little the mathematical aspects of these various concerns is a bit like taking out the garbage. You can't just do it once, since the garbage tends to pile up and proliferate. And it has to be an ongoing practice. The same mistakes keep cropping up. And as part of the rationale for this book and for the inclusion of older but still germane writings of mine, in any case, the broad categories of topics discussed are puzzles, a bit of probability, lies, logic, miscalculations, political partisanship, and religious dogmatism. And the approach throughout, one reason I don't have slides, will be based on stories and vignettes and puzzles that help explain, contextualize, and vivify the relevant mathematical notions. So there won't be formulas and equations, although they'll often be implicit in the stories. So the stories bring the numbers to life. I mean, if you ever see someone, perhaps a stretch, but you ever see someone who has just died, their face doesn't look anything like it did 5 minutes before they died because it's not animated. And you need stories to animate, and as I say, vivify the mathematics of them. And so the interplay between numbers and narratives, or if you want to vary the alliteration a little bit, between stories and statistics, has played a role in several of my books. As I wrote in my first book, Math and Humor, both math and humor are activities undertaken for their own sake. In both, there's ingenuity and cleverness are prized, of course. Logic, patterns, rules, and structures are also essential to both math and humor, albeit, of course, with a different emphasis. In humor, the logic is often inverted, the patterns are messed up, are distorted, rules are misunderstood intentionally, and structures are confused. Yet these transformations aren't random and must still make sense on some level. And jokes, like math, regularly depend on the literal interpretation of statements. In mathematics, you have to interpret definition literally, not in some vague way. In humor, it's to stress a humorous juxtaposition. One I heard that is kind of weird, but I tweeted it. I kind of like it. Somebody asked, "Will glass coffins ever catch on?" And somebody responds, "Remains to be seen." Okay, that's a silly joke. There's nothing mathematical about it, but it does show that a careful phrasing of stories is important. Well, in any case, somewhere in the vague middle of the math humor continuum lie puzzles. They're often more substantial than mere jokes, yet they can reveal a significant mathematical fact. The analog of a joke's punchline is the aha moment, when a surprising insight dawns on us. And the thought process required to solve a puzzle is often mirrors what you do in a mathematical analysis. Not exactly math and not exactly humor. Puzzles often provide a gateway to real mathematics. Surprising insights, as I just mentioned, bring to mind a comment by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who once wrote that a good and serious work in philosophy could be written that consisted entirely of jokes, interpreted quite broadly to include puzzles and anecdotes. The idea was that if one gets the joke, one gets the relevant philosophical point. My book, I Think Therefore I Laugh, I Think Therefore I Laugh, attempted to illustrate Wittgenstein's contention about philosophical ideas. But in the same way, jokes can provide insights into philosophical problems, and in the same way that they provide insights into philosophical problems and conundrums, mathematical puzzles can be an effective means to explore mathematical notions. So in any case, with this preamble, let me begin with a puzzle, of which there are many, most of them having some social implication. Let me begin with the counterintuitive Monty Hall problem. It continues to baffle people if the emails I still receive insisting that the sender's proposed solution is correct is any indication. In any case, what is the Monty Hall problem? It's based on the show Let's Make a Deal, which was popular in the 60s and 70s and has been resurrected in various formats since then. In its original version, the contestant was presented with 3 doors, behind one of which is a new car. The other 2 doors had booby prices behind them. And there's a host, the eponymous Monty Hall, who asked the contestant to guess which of the 3 doors obscures the new car, which would be the big prize. And the guest picks a door, and the host, Monty Hall, opens one of the other 2 doors that the guest did not pick. And he's always careful to open the door behind which there's nothing. So again, the guest picks a door, the host picks one of the other 2 doors behind which he knows there's nothing. And now there's only 2 doors that are closed, and the host then asks the contestant, "Do you want to switch your bet? The door you have or the remaining unopened door?" And many people think it doesn't make any difference. There are two doors. Chances are 50-50. The car is behind one of them. But it turns out that you should switch. If you switch, your chance of winning the car chances of winning the car rise from 1/3 to 2/3, because your original guess had a 1/3 chance of winning the car. 2/3 is the probability the car is behind one of the other two doors. But since the host opens up a door that he knew had nothing behind it, this 2/3 probability is now concentrated on the unopened door. So you should switch. It increases your probability from 1/3 to 2/3. Actually, some very first-rate mathematicians, Paul Erdos, maybe he misunderstood the problem, insisted the answer was a half. And of course, it depends on the careful wording of the problem. But there are variants of this problem. One that I made up has to do with Monty Hall's evil cousin, Taunty Hall. And in this case, there are three doors and one contestant and the host, Taunty Hall. But behind one of the doors is a spring-activated toxic spray, which, if it's open, will spray out on the contestant. And behind the other two doors, there's nothing. So a contestant again picks a door, and Taunty Hall opens one of the other two doors behind which he knows there's nothing, and then asks the contestant if the contestant wants to switch his bet. And in this case, he should not switch his bet, because the probability he picked the door behind which there's a toxic spray is 1/3. He wants to keep it 1/3. If he switches to the other door, he has a 2/3 probability of being sprayed. And in a way, this is consistent with COVID-19 counsel, which tells you to limit your exposure to as few people as possible. So in this case, to as few doors as possible. So it's kind of a dual of the Monty Hall problem, where it makes sense to stick with your first guess and not switch. In any case, there are many, as I say, puzzles. I talk about the Ferrando puzzle, whereby two losing games played in succession result in a game with a positive payoff. There are a lot of scaling problems, colored hats problems that deal with error correction. A presidential quiz. It seems to me that quizzes, presidential candidates should be confronted with very simple math problems. This will never happen, but in any case, I construct what is such a quiz might consist of. You go to any company, especially a high-tech company, you always give quizzes, but you apply for leader of the free world and you don't have to know what 2 and 2 is. Talk about some of the puzzles are more mathematical. The number E's for basic nature, everybody knows about its role in finance, but it's in a sense present in stars in the sky. You break a square region up to a little bunch of little squares, and then count the squares that have bright stars in them. In any case, the ratio of all the squares to the unoccupied squares turns out to be the number E. I mean, that probably isn't comprehensible, but in that brief account, but it's kind of interesting. Actually, one of my favorite instances of the number E is the following. Have your phone generate numbers between, let's say, 0 and 1,000, not just integers, but numbers in general. So you pick a number between 0 and 1,000, then you pick another one and you add it to the first one, and if necessary, you pick a third one and add it to the previous two, and then a fourth, and add it. In any case, the average number of guesses you're going to have to, the average number of random numbers you pick that are necessary to get a sum greater than 1,000 turns out to be the number E, which is rather strange. So as I say, it pops up in all sorts of places. In any case, and in addition to puzzles, I talk about probability and misconceptions regarding it. But probability itself is kind of natural. It grew out of everyday words. Consider the terms for central tendency. Words like mean, median, and mode, which have a technical meaning in probability. But these notions grew out of everyday words like usual, customary, typical, same, middling, standard, stereotypical, ordinary, normal, and so on, and analogous words in other languages. Or you can examine the precursors of notions of statistical variation, standard variation, variance, and the like. They also grew out of, and are refinements of words like unusual, peculiar, strange, singular, original, deviant, bizarre, and so on. And probability itself is presaged in everyday words like chance, likelihood, fate, odds, gods, fortune, luck, happenstance, and so on. And of course, we all change our mind about things when we get new information. Not all of us do, but most of us do. And we often do it in a kind of grossly inaccurate manner. But Bayes' theorem, named after Thomas Bay, 18th century minister, is just a refinement of what we do when we learn new information. The theorem just provides a formal and precise way to update our estimates of the probability of some event. One simple example, let's say there are two coins before us. One of them is fair and the other one is two-headed. We don't know which is which, but we choose one of these two coins and initially assume the probability that there's 1/2, that is the fair one, because there's two coins, one fair, one two-headed. But then we flip it 3 times and it comes up heads all 3 times. So now it's clear that the probability that's fair should be less than 1/2. Bayes' theorem tells us what it is exactly. It's 1/9. In any case, the bottom line is probability statistics aren't alien ideas, but are in dire need of distillation and clarification. Many of us are like the Molière character, surprised that he spoke prose his whole life. We've all been speaking probability our whole lives, but we speak it badly. So taking a course of studying it is a way to improve our facility with the language. Our vocabulary, many people's vocabulary for probability is quite limited. It's something like 1 in a million, 50-50, or a sure thing, and that doesn't go very far. Despite the fact that it's natural, it grew out of these natural terms, it's a difficult subject, as you know. Perhaps the main reason is that people don't naturally think in terms of probability, at least in a careful way. A second reason is that it's avoided, if not especially for religious people, if not scorned, because of their belief that everything happens for a reason. Everything happens for a reason, and that therefore outcomes are certain to happen or certain not to happen. The every blade of grass kind of people. And the third obstacle for many is that much of the reasoning and many of the conclusions in probability are tricky and counterintuitive. The well-known birthday problem is an example. You just need 23 people in the room for the probability to be 50%, 1/2, that at least 2 would have the same birthday. Conditional probability is even more difficult and plays a lot of roles, plays an important role in everyday life. You've probably heard of the Innocence Project, a group of people who go around and investigate the conviction of people in jail for murder or whatever, because often they're there because of mistakes of the prosecutor or the judge, and whatever. The prosecutor's paradox makes clear what that is. Let's say the police arrest somebody and they find evidence that this person has been in area where there's been a murder, talk to the victim, is tall and lanky, wears a t-shirt, long hair, whatever, various things. So given that, the probability of this evidence, given the person is innocent, might be quite small. This person has all these characteristics, might be a number of characteristics, and they arrest the guy. He's a suspect. If he's innocent, the probability of having these various evidentiary factors true of him would be quite small. He'd be convicted. That's the prosecutor's paradox. But a defense attorney would look at a different conditional probability. Given the evidence, what's the probability that the suspect is innocent? And the evidence might be what it is, but he might show that it's characteristic of a number of determinative of a number of people in the area. A number of people talked to the victim, were in the area, were tall and lanky, had all these other characteristics. So even though, the probability of innocence given evidence is often much larger. So prosecutors talk about the probability of the evidence obtaining given the innocence of the suspect. Defense attorney rightfully talks about the probability of innocence given the evidence. So again, it's just basically conditional probability is like a conditional statement in logic. If A, then B is very different than if B, then A. Or the probability that given someone's a CEO of a large company, the conditional probability that person is a male, given he's a CEO, is high. But the converse conditional probability, the probability that somebody is a CEO, given he's a male, is very low. Most males are not CEOs of big companies. So, this plays a role in COVID. I talked about false positive, pooling blood. Sometimes the problem with probability is that the terms mean something technically, but not in everyday life, in everyday parlance. 4 times the odds, for example, does not equal 4 times the probability. And because odds mean something different, and that can often lead to misunderstanding. Relative risk, there are lots of terms. Here's a weird example regarding conditional probability. Imagine a woman has 2 children. The probability they're both boys, given the older child is a boy, is clearly 1/2. Given that she's got 2 children, 2 boys, given that the older child of her 2 children is a boy, the probability she's got 2 boys is 1/2. But if you know only that at least one of her children is a boy, the probability she's got 2 boys, conditional probability of 2 boys given at least 1 boy, is not 1/2, but is 1/3. Those 2 cases, I think, are straightforward. In the latter case, if there's at least 1 boy, it could be boy and then girl, or girl and then boy, or boy. And so the probability is 1/3. But this is what's odd. I'm not going to explain it here, but it's in the book. The woman, again, not the same woman, different woman, has 2 children, and at least one of them is a boy born in the summer. So she's got 2 children, at least one of them is a boy born in the summer. The probability she has 2 boys, given that, is 7/15. That seems kind of weird. Why should when the boy is born have an effect on the probability? But it does. Talk about randonauts in a book in one column. It's popular since people generally seek significance in even the most random of events. So what the game is they come up to this device, and the guy running the game asks them to think about something they're very interested in, some long lost relative, some love affair that didn't work out, or some event in their past. And then they, quote, generate some random numbers. They say they're quantum generated. And then they translate these quantum generated numbers into GPS of coordinates of a nearby area within 5 miles. And they're told to go to this area with this question in mind about their past or long lost friend and see what it tells them about that. And amazingly, people come back and say, oh, this showed me that such and such really didn't run off with my good friend or whatever. So I mean, they just make up stories, and it the whole game kind of indulges people's desire to ascribe significance to stuff that's just random. Talk about lies and liars, which is a big topic when you're talking about politics, which I do in the book, and how to get information from people who always lie or people that always tell the truth, or in Ray Smolyan's extra category of more difficult category, those who occasionally lie, and various puzzles from philosophy. Justified true belief does not equal knowledge. For a long time, people said, well, if you believe something and it's true, you have justification for believing it, you know it. And I give an example from presidential debates in 2020, involving Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders, which makes it clear that justified true belief does not equal knowledge. And there are lots of other examples. Talk about the Kruskal card trick, which should be of special interest to Skeptical Inquirer fans. If you haven't seen it, it's amazing. The card trick works as follows. You have a deck of cards, throw away the face cards. So they're just cards from ace through 10. And you tell somebody to turn over a card early in the deck. Let's say the person turns over the card and it's a number 3, some early in the deck. And you tell him to do this secretly so you can't see. If he turns over a card with a 3 on it, he should move ahead 3 cards into the deck, and that'll become his new cards, or her new card. And let's say that's a 5. If 5 is a secret card, the person looks at it, moves ahead 5 cards in the deck, and let's say there's a 9 there. And again, this iterates. If 9 is a secret card, again, he doesn't show this to the person who's conducting this game. He does the same thing. Maybe the 2 is the next thing. Anyway, at the end of the deck, when there's no more room to go, the guy running this card trick says, "I bet you've got a 6. That's a 6." And the guy is kind of amazed. How did you know that? And the reason is that the guy running it has been doing the same thing with the same deck. And after a while, even though he starts with a different card, after a while, the 2 choices will be the same, and thereafter they're going to move in lockstep, and therefore arrive at the 6 at the end of the game. And I proposed, based on the Kruskal card trick, a religious hoax. You take a passage from the Bible, you tell somebody to pick any word from the beginning of the passage. If it's got 5 letters, move ahead 5 words. And then once you move ahead 5 words, you look at how many letters are in that word. Let's say there's 7, and you move ahead 7 words in the passage and keep on going. And then it comes to the end. And if you artfully choose the passage, it might be a word that scares people. It might be hell or whatever. You can do it with the Declaration of Independence, and it'll always end on happiness. You could try it yourself. Just have the Declaration of Independence, pick a word from the beginning, however many letters it has, move ahead that many words, count the number of letters in that, and so on. It'll almost always end on happiness. So lies, and so on. I mentioned something about the efficient market hypothesis. is kind of a liar's paradox in a way. It's if you know what it is, it's that information about a stock is kind of instantly available, almost instantly available, and it's reflected in the price. So the efficient market hypothesis is actually true to the extent that most investors believe it to be false, which is kind of a nice result. Also talk about metrics that people use for various quantities they want to estimate, and they're not always, in fact, often not the right metric, or maybe there is no right metric. I mean, suppose, for example, there's a disease that arises only when people are in their early 50s, and it always proves fatal with or without treatment at about the age of 65. Okay, I just made up these numbers, of course. Further, let's suppose that the clinical symptoms for the disease don't manifest themselves until people are in their early 60s. And one state, Minnesota, for example, mandates early screening when people turn 50. And so given these assumptions, 100% of people will have, in Minnesota, let's say, 100% 5-year survival rate. So that's the metric, 100% 5-year survival rate, you're fine. While a different state, let's say Alabama, which discourages such screening, will have a 0% 5-year survival rate. But they get the first symptoms in their early 60s and they die when they're 65. So all people in both states who develop the disease will die at about at the same time, when they're 65. So the 5-year survival rate is, in that situation, a totally useless metric. And again, it's an extreme case, but I talk about various metrics that are commonly used in medicine and elsewhere that don't really measure what they purport to measure. Talk about apophenia in spherical cows. Apophenia is seeing patterns which aren't there. I use blood clots from the COVID vaccine. Interesting, vaccine comes from the Latin word for cow, or French word for cow. And I note that the similar kind of responses that characterize resistance to COVID were the case when people were worried about anthrax years ago. And in any case, normal distributions, the defense of fuzzy math. Fuzzy math is many times the only kind of math you can have. In fact, you should be very suspicious if the numbers you're given are too precise. In fact, I think you can often tell the difference between whether people have a background in science and the people who don't. The people who have a background, if you give a number with five numbers after the decimal point, people with a background in science are going to say, that's weird. How do you have 5 decimals? How can you measure that precisely? Whereas if you don't have a background in science, it often impresses people to say, wow, this guy really knows his stuff. Five numbers beyond the decimal point. So apophenia is unfortunately quite common, and not just with COVID, but in general. And in a way, it's to some extent synonymous with coincidence. But estimating numbers is a useful number, especially with regard to blood clots. I mean, spherical cows is a way that to refer to Fermi problems, where you estimate things by making very simplified assumptions. Like, let's assume the cow is spherical, even though you've never heard a spherical cow. I talk about abortion. I give in the book, by the way, whose title is "Who's Counting?" You get a free, no expenses paid trip to the destination of your choice if you buy a copy. In any case, there are a bunch of thought experiments in the book, and one involves abortion, which is obviously quite topical given the Supreme Court's recent decision and the decisions leading up to it. And anyway, in an effort to introduce a kind of crazy argument, let me begin with a classic story. It's usually attributed to George Bernard Shaw. He was seated at some posh dinner party, and Shaw asked the woman sitting next to him if she'd sleep with him for $1 million. She laughs and said she would. And then after that, he asked her, would she sleep with him for $10? And she's outraged. And she says, what do you think I am? And he replies, that has just been established. Now we're just haggling about the prize. Okay, this is relevant for the abortion story. So numbers make a difference. So we might ask, what position would abortion foes take were two biological facts to change? The first is that for some reason, a worldwide pandemic or an invincible new virus, a climatic catastrophe in the atmosphere, the effect of some new substance in the environment, whatever, pregnant women throughout the world would find themselves carrying 10 to 12 fetuses at a time. And the second, more minor change is that advances in medical, surgical, neonatal technology would make it possible to easily save some or all of these fetuses if doctors intervene a few months after conception. Without this intervention, however, all the fetuses would die. Okay, we'd have to assume that abortion opponents who believe that all fetuses have an absolute right to life would surely opt for some intervention. If not, all the fetuses would die. They would therefore have to choose to either adhere to their absolutist position and insist that all the fetuses live and thus be overwhelmed by a population explosion of overwhelming magnitude, or else act to save only one or a few of the fetuses. But since all the fetuses are viable, the latter choice would be tantamount to abortion. And in any case, after this is acknowledged by abortion opponents, if they acknowledge this, then you can start haggling about the details. All right, it's a knockdown argument. It's not obviously not a knockdown argument, although you might get knocked down if you make it in certain places. But I talked a little bit of, well, more than a little bit about politics and misinformation, gullibility, about the bullshit asymmetry principle. And basically, it says that the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than necessary to produce it. And it's kind of like a second law of political thermodynamics. Actually, Mark Twain said it even more succinctly. He said it's much easier to con people than to convince them that they've been conned. In any case, I talk about this thief. I'm running short of time. I guess I have a little time left. Wolf's dilemma. Why are political parties especially Republicans, why do they move in lockstep? Well, Wolf's dilemma is somewhat relevant. It goes as follows. There's a billionaire, a beneficent billionaire, makes the following offer to a group of people. Each member of the group is told that they can secretly press the send key on their keyboards within 30 minutes or decide not to do so. If they all refrain from pressing the key in front of them, they'll each receive a big reward, say $100,000, wired to their bank accounts. But if even one person in the group presses the key, those who do will receive a smaller reward, say $10,000, while those who don't press the key will receive a pittance or even nothing. All right, political rewards are, of course, quite nebulous as opposed to these quantitative figures. But nevertheless, you can look at the political instances of this. If Republicans hang together, they enhance their power, they maintain a majority. This was before the Democrats took over. They maintain a majority, impeachment and whatever. And if they deviate from that, those who deviate win a smaller reward. They might be lionized in liberal press for a week or two, but it pays to refrain from pressing the button, or in this case, to stick together with your fellow Republicans. Internet and fake news, talk about standard cognitive foibles, anchoring effect, availability error, confirmation bias. But there's one cognitive foible that is less well known that is relevant to fake news, I think, and that's called the conjunction fallacy. Imagine you've got a senator, Senator Jones, and he's well known as a moderate. He's straightforward. He lives modestly in a modest home with his wife and sick daughter. He's above board in every way, very conservatively dressed. He's a wonderful senator. So given this background about Senator Jones, which of these two options is more likely? He takes a bribe from a lobbyist, or he takes a bribe from a lobbyist and he uses the money to pay for his daughter's expensive operation. Okay, given his background, many people would say it's number two. He wouldn't do it unless he did it for his sick daughter. But the first option is actually more likely because it's easier to satisfy just one condition, that he took a bribe, than two conditions, that he took the bribe and used it to pay for his daughter's operation. So the more conditions you have, the more detailed your story, often the more plausible it becomes, even though it becomes less probable. So there's this tension between probability and plausibility. You can make your story more plausible at the cost of making it less probable. And there's so many factoids and non-factoids on the internet. It's very easy to cobble them together and concoct a religious, ridiculous story like Pizzagate with QAnon or whatever. So you've got all these things, and the conjunction fallacy, as well as these other cognitive foibles, make internet fake news all the more likely. Let me check the time here. A few more. Well, I think I talked about rank voting, gerrymandering. I'll skip that. Religious dogmatism, complex, very creationist, probability flaws in creation scientist. Greg Chaitin's proof of Gödel's theorem, disagreement with Wigner about the amazing effectiveness, inscrutable effectiveness of mathematics. And finally, I write a dreamy text message with God that's kind of long, and I like, but I think maybe this would be a good place to stop and answer any questions or entertain any comments.
All right, thanks, John. We do have a few questions. Let's start with, so you talked about probability. I love this one. Las Vegas, any casino really takes advantage of people's odd beliefs about things. On the roulette wheel, they list all the prior numbers that came up and whether they're red or black. And they do that for a reason. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, people like to, we're creating pattern recognizing animals, and people like to think that they can scope out a pattern that will help them predict the next outcome of the spin. But if the spins are independent, that doesn't help at all. But it gives some people the illusion that they're doing something. Knowing that, knowing that black has come up more in the past doesn't mean red's going to come up more, or this number is going to come up less frequently because it's come up 2 times in the last 9 spins. So it feeds into people's desire for significance, and using that significance to enrich themselves or more likely impoverish themselves.
Yeah, the gambler's fallacy, one of my favorites. Linda wanted to know, you mentioned COVID and the false positives and false negatives come up. She was kind of curious as to, and I don't know what the rate of false positives or false negatives are, but how many tests do you have to take to start being really confident that you have an answer?
Well, if you take more tests, of course, as you can be more certain. That's true. Some people take Cologuard tests, for example. There are a lot of false positives there, but they take, you know, take 5 Cologuard tests and it all indicates you've got a problem. That does mean something more. But there's a lot of, I mean, many people, anti-vax people would point to the fact that after the vaccine came out in states where the vast majority of people did get vaccinated, let's say Massachusetts, let's say 90, I'm picking a number out there, 90% of the people are vaccinated. And then they say, but look at the people in the hospital. Half of them are vaccinated and half of them are not vaccinated. So that means vaccinations don't do any good. And that was the case. That was the argument, different numbers, but essentially that. If you look at hospitalizations, just as many vaccinated people as unvaccinated people. Of course, let's say there's 200 people in this hospital, 100 of them came from the 90% of people who were vaccinated, and 100 of them came from a much smaller pool, the 10% who were unvaccinated. So the fact that they're equal numbers is not as telling as many vaccine skeptics like to think, assuming they think at all.
John wanted to know about your students over the years. Are they getting better or worse at math? Is there any trend you can talk about?
It's hard to say. I mean, the very best students are, I mean, they might be, are still there, and maybe they're more numerous, but the poorer students, there's still a large pool of poorer students. But in general, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, it's such. I mean, I teach at one school. Actually, I teach at Temple University, and often in the summer I teach a special course at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And there are different bodies of students, different backgrounds, but the students in Singapore, it's more selective than their students. They do work much harder, they do much better, but Temple has some first-rate students there as well. And I think overall, I'd like to say getting a little bit better.
I always wanted to ask about this. I remember reading some polls among scientists and the various pursuits about levels of belief in God. And I was surprised to see that among mathematicians, it spiked a little bit, that mathematicians, there was a little higher belief in God than some of the other sciences. Do you have a reason for that?
I think so. I've read that as well. I mean, it's still high, but one reason is kind of mathematicians, in some sense, deal with imaginary objects all the time. They imagine all these mathematical entities are cavorting in some kind of Platonic heaven, and so they're, it's, if you're a Platonist in mathematics, and whether you are formally or just behave as if you are, it predisposes you to believe in not imaginary, but objects that are just determined by a set of axioms. They're also used to dealing with, making a few simple assumptions, and from those simple assumptions deriving everything else. So if you make a few simple assumptions about, let's say you're a theist, then everything that follows from it, or maybe you don't even have to assume a God, you assume some things, and then from that you're able to prove deductively, like Saint Anselm. There are lots of obviously lots of flawed, in fact, every flawed argument for the existence of God. But I think those two things, deriving consequences from very minimal assumptions and dealing with mathematical objects, as I say, cavorting in some Platonic heaven.
Let's just do a couple more questions here. Someone wanted you to settle a bet, and it sounds technical, but what's the difference between bimodal distribution and binary as it relates to biology? Does that question make sense to you?
Well, bimodal distribution has two basic modes. I mean, sometimes in some classes, for example, there might be a bimodal grade distribution. that the two most common grades are B and D, and A, C, and F are uncommon. So it's like a double hump distribution. And binary, I'm not sure. Binary is kind of a loaded term, especially in Florida, where DeSantis doesn't want you to mention non-binary. But I'm not sure what the questioner meant about binary, but perhaps that, you know, if binary is very rigid demarcation, I don't know.
Okay, last question. But this is kind of interesting for those of us who were actually alive before calculators came along and had to do a lot of the math, just like write it down. Linda wants to know, do you find that too many people rely on smart devices to perform mathematical functions, and that makes people less able to grasp some of these counterintuitive mathematical ideas?
I don't know. Simple answer is no, I don't think that. I think it saves time. You don't have to do any long computation. I mean, especially let's say you're inverting a matrix. Once you know how to do it, why spend the time doing it? Or even simpler, long calculation involving present value or whatever. I mean, why not have it built in so you can think at a more conceptual level and not at the basic level? As I've written several places, mathematics is no more computation than literature is typing. You need it, but it's much more than that.
Fantastic. The book is called Who's Counting? And it's coming out in September. If you're smart, you'll leave the house right now and get in line at your local bookstore. Forget about Amazon. Be first to buy this book.
You can also order it on Amazon.
Okay, all right. Well, to be
or
fair.
a lot of smaller online as well, or your local bookstore. Any place is fine.
Buy them and send them to everybody you know, because we want to keep John rich and happy.
Jim, let me shake your hand.
Right.
A digital shake, too.
A digital shake. Thank you. I do that.
Okay.
Thanks again for being with us. We'll look for you in the next time you write for Skeptical Inquirer. And thanks everyone else for tuning in. Watch your email for future Skeptical Inquirer presents. I'm Jim Underdown. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye. Let's see, are we done?